Author Alexandra Zapruder discusses her book about the Kennedy assassination, 26 Seconds.
Thank you so much to the JCC and the Ann Arbor District Library for inviting me. I so appreciate it. I'm so glad to be here. I thought I would begin by talking a little bit about how this book came about. And then I will sort of walk you through the sort of three main phases of this story. My grandfather's story up until the time of the assassination, the Life magazine years when Life magazine owned and controlled the film, and then from 1975 until the year 2000 when it was again the responsibility of our family. This is not a book that I ever thought that I would write. I grew up in a family, I grew up in Washington, D.C., in a family in which we very, very rarely talked about the film. And I've been asked many times if it was taboo or if it was a secret or there was something kind of hidden about it. It wasn't that. I knew about it, I always knew about it, I knew that our name was attached to this important moment, but it was not something that was sort of central to our identity. It was always kind of off to the side. And I understood from a very early age that this partly had to do with the fact that this was a very painful memory for my parents and my aunt and uncle, and that it had been quite traumatic for my grandfather. And I also grew up in a family in which when it came up, the message that was delivered to myself and my brothers, because we all carried the name Zapruder, unlike our four cousins who were also the grandchildren of Abe Zapruder, but who had a different name, that we were not to brag about it, we were not to call attention to it, that this was something that was painful and regrettable in the sense of our family's connection to it, that it was a national tragedy, and this was not something to, to take lightly, which was a sort of set of instructions that I thoroughly ignored when I was 10 and 11 and 12 years old and realized that my grandfather was famous, and I thought that was, pretty great. But as I got older, I of course understood more the depth of this story. And I think I probably would have gone through most of my life the same way, except that in 2004, my dad quite suddenly got sick with a brain tumor. And at some point, quite early in his illness, he said to me, I think somebody should interview me about the film. I think somebody should ask me, meaning I should interview him about the film. And to my everlasting regret, I did not do that. It was too difficult. It was too difficult for him to talk at that time and to sort of acknowledge what was happening with his illness. And so that opportunity was lost. In the years after my dad died, I began to understand that there were family records, there were people who had been close to our family who knew a great deal about the history of the film, there were legal documents, there were all kinds of, there was ephemera, really, and historical documentation that belonged to our family, and that someone was going to need to take responsibility for that. Once again, that someone was me. And so in order to do that, I faced a problem, which was that in order to gather these records and put some order to them and conduct some interviews, I needed to know something about the history of the Zapruder film. And I didn't know anything about the Zapruder film. I mean, I knew the very outlines of the story, but I really was, I had no idea sort of what an interesting and complex life this piece of history had led. And so I began reading. And as I read, I began to see that the public story of the film was incomplete, and that there were enormous gaps, there were mistakes, there were, how can I put it, sort of inaccuracies about our family and what we had done or not done. And it became clear to me that a whole understanding of the Zapruder film, what it meant to the assassination, what it meant to the generation that lived through this time, and what it meant culturally and in other ways, was missing without an understanding of our family's relationship to it. All of this would not have been the case had the film been taken from my grandfather the day of the assassination, and we never had anything to do with it again. But my grandfather had a great impact on the sale. I mean, it was his decision to sell it to Life magazine, and then it was returned to our family, and my father managed it for 25 years. So that process of fusing the public story and the private story was ultimately the work of this book. The one thing that I would say before I go back in time and introduce you a little bit to my grandfather and his life is that the main thing that was missing in the public stories was the understanding of this as a home movie. You know, it was talked about as an assassination record. It was a key piece of evidence. It was a source of controversy. There were bootlegs. There was a cultural icon. But people didn't seem to understand that for my grandfather, first and foremost, and for my father, and for all of us, it was personal. He felt deeply responsible for having taken this film. And so his values, his background, his sense of what was right and wrong and what was important, all shaped the decisions that he made in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, and then reverberated through our family for all of those decades to follow. So that is why it is worthwhile, I think, to go back and learn a little bit about him and who he was, because all of those things shaped the decisions that he made in this critical moment. This picture, I should just say, is my grandfather and grandmother. My grandfather's holding his brand new Bell & Howell camera. This is 1962, shortly after he purchased the camera, of course, before the assassination. And they were visiting my father in Oxford, and he had bought this camera and wanted, of course, to take home movies of his trip. And this was a photograph that I stumbled upon in the course of doing this work, and was, as you can imagine, surprised and also touched to see. You can see just how very proud he is to be holding the camera, and how much, clearly, how much he loved it. My grandfather was born in Imperial Russia in 1905. Everything I'm about to say for the next 10 or 15 minutes will be very familiar to many of you, because they led a sort of archetypal life of Jewish immigrants who came to this country and sort of ultimately reached the middle class. But his beginnings were very humble and very difficult. He is the little boy in his mother's arms in that photograph. He has an older sister, Sarah Ida, a brother, Morris, who was disabled in one leg, and his sister, Fanny. They were extremely poor. They lived in a place and a time in which there was rampant anti-Semitism, repeated violence against Jews, and he was someone who he was born with a sort of intense curiosity about the world. He wanted to learn, he wanted to study, he wanted to play music, and these were all things that he could not do as a Jewish boy in Imperial Russia. His father left in 1909 to come to America and was naturalized as an American citizen in 1915, and the family prepared to follow him to America in 1918, and their journey leaving Kovel, which is where they were from, to America was interrupted by the Bolshevik Revolution. It took them 2 years to reach America in 1920. And at some point during that time, Morris, the brother, either died or was killed. When I grew up, I was told that he died. My grandfather said that he was killed. His sister said that he was killed in a different circumstance than the way that my grandfather had told the story. So the story is not clear. But in any case, I came upon in my research this emergency passport application that my great-grandmother filled out to come to America, and you can see I think I see, at least on her face, this is a woman who had endured an enormous amount. She had her first child at 14, had been married off to my great-grandfather in an arranged marriage, presumably, which was quite common at the time, and had lived through many pogroms, World War I, raised her children alone from 1909 to 1920, and the death of her son by the time this photograph was taken. My grandfather came to America hell-bent on becoming an American. This was absolutely ingrained in him. This is what he wanted more than anything else. And in this way, it separated him very much from the rest of his family. The first thing, according to family lore, that he did with his first paycheck was to go out and buy himself a violin so that he could play music. He loved music, and he never had a lesson but could play by ear and played his whole life. He went to night school and learned English, and I found among our papers his certificate of literacy. And then, like so many other Jews of the time, he went to work on 7th Avenue in the garment industry. And this is his dues booklet from his union booklet from the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And if you open it up, you would see that he very faithfully paid his dues every month, and the stamps are all there to prove it. So he set about becoming an American, and unlike his sisters and his parents, who continued to speak in Yiddish together and had very thick, heavy accents, and who, sort of maintained a kind of shtetl mentality, he wanted to leave all of that behind. My grandmother and her family lived in the same apartment building, in the same tenement in Brooklyn. And she fell in love with him instantly, I was told, by her best friend, who I interviewed at age 97 for this book. My grandmother, obviously he fell in love with her too, because look at her, right? She's completely beautiful. And they had a tremendous sense of style. Everyone always said, like, when they walked in the room, everyone stopped and looked at them. They'd always dressed beautifully. They cared a lot about being modern people, about, sort of dressing the part of, a young American couple. She had been born in this country. And when they married in 1933, they, of course, went to Niagara Falls for their honeymoon, like everyone else did, and then went on to the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, which many of you may know, the theme of which was A Century of Progress. And my grandfather, in addition to his great love of music, also loved anything that was that reflected modernity. He loved gadgets. He was always wiring things around the house. He had a dark room for still photographs in their apartment building starting in the late 1920s or early 30s. And in 1934, when my aunt was born, he began taking home movies. And I always sort of laugh about this because we have all the home movies, of course, that he took. And they are, like everyone else's home movies, sort of incredibly boring, right? Because they're pictures of my aunt, rolling over, and my aunt having a bath, and my aunt learning to eat, and my aunt learning to walk. But they, on the other hand, they capture this time that is now lost, the streets of Brooklyn, and the family that is gone, and then their lives as they continued to grow and have a family. In 1941, my grandfather had an opportunity to go to Dallas for a business venture, to work for Nardis, which was a sportswear company. And he was someone who was fairly reticent and reserved in his personality, and he tended to hang back. He didn't like to put himself forward, and my aunt, who gave me a lot of information about him, told me that a lot of this was about his insecurity about not ever having had an education and having been sort of made his way on his wits, but not someone who felt that he was properly educated. My grandmother, on the other hand, was a force of nature, and she was always there to sort of give him the push that he needed at the right time. In fact, there were quite a number of women in his life, his mother first, then my grandmother, and later his longtime assistant, who fulfilled that role for him. And so he went out to Dallas to look at this job opportunity and came back and said that it wasn't for him and he wasn't interested. And he later said that he took one look at my grandmother's face and realized that he had made the wrong decision. And so when the offer came around again a few months later, he said yes without any hesitation. And they struck out for a new life. And really a lot of it for her, with my grandmother in particular, but for both of them, was that they wanted to get away from this very stifling, suffocating life of living in the same apartment building with his parents and his sisters and their husbands, where everyone spoke Yiddish and everyone had a sort of mentality of the old country, and they wanted something new. And just to give you a sense of this, one of the stories in our family is that my Aunt Fanny, who was the little girl, that the first time that she ever left Brooklyn for Manhattan was when my parents were married in 1963. So 43 years of remaining in Brooklyn, never leaving Brooklyn. So they were, of course, they were very different. And I think you can see, I love this photograph of them. I always think that my grandfather had three great loves. He loved music, he loved home movies, and he loved my grandmother. They had two children. That's my Aunt Myrna in the front, and my father looking adoringly at his father on his mother's lap. And they really, the story of their life in Dallas was one of upward mobility. He struck out after a while and started his own business, which failed. He tried again and formed a company called Jennifer Juniors, which was successful. And ultimately, my aunt went to SMU and got married. My father went to OU and then went to Harvard Law School. And by the time the early 1960s rolled around, my grandfather was ready to begin to slow down a little bit. His children were launched. There were grandchildren and more on the way. And they were, I think, feeling that it was time to enjoy the fruits of their long, long labors of making good in this country. So here's my grandfather at his office at Jennifer Juniors, which was located at 501 Elm Street, so just adjacent to Dealey Plaza. And he's here with Marilyn Sitzman, who was his receptionist, who, until I found this photograph, I had only seen interviews of her after the fact. And I was kind of shocked by how hot she is, I mean, basically. And I also love that she's standing there smoking, and I always think like it was probably like 8 o'clock in the morning, But they were, this was, this sort of unusual photograph a rare photograph that we have of sort of the inside of the business. And by this time, in the 1960s, I don't know exactly when this photograph was taken, but I think it was sometime in the 1960s. My family were already very, very devoted Kennedy people. My aunt had volunteered for the Kennedy campaign, had sold poll tax to register black voters in Dallas. My grandfather, of course, loved the president. And one of the things that was so amazing in the course of this work was that I found, in the course of my research, a letter that my father had written to President Kennedy in 1962, having just getting ready to graduate from Harvard Law. And it's a beautiful letter from a very earnest young Henry Zapruder saying, I want to be part of the new frontier. And you asked not what my country can do for me, but what can I do for my country? And so I'm asking you, with my degree in law, what can I do to serve my country? He did not get a job with the administration at that time. That came later. But I think the letter and the stories that I always heard really reflected this sense that I always knew, and that, of course, many of you will completely relate to, which is that Kennedy represented progress. He represented democratic values. He represented social justice. He was himself from a minority religion, being Catholic and having made it to the presidency. And so everything about John F. Kennedy as a young visionary leader suited the sort of values and sensibilities of our family. My dad went to Oxford for a postdoc for 1 year after not having gotten a job in the administration, and then returned to the States in the spring of 1963. My mother met him at the pier, and he proposed, and she accepted. And sometime during that summer, he was offered a job in the tax division of the Justice Department, working for Bobby Kennedy. And so they were married on October 31st, 1963, took their week-long honeymoon, and settled into Washington just 2 weeks before the assassination for my father to begin the job that he had always wanted in the Kennedy administration. So you'll all remember this photograph, of course. The morning of the assassination, there are a few things to say about this. First of all, my aunt went down to Love Field with her best friend that morning and were there to greet the president and the first lady. My uncle was on Main Street watching the parade go by. And my grandfather, was in his office was the Daltex building that you can see right there across from the Texas School Book Depository building. And so he was very close. And he decided that, the whole office was going to go down and watch the motorcade go by in this last final little swing down Elm Street before going off to the Trademark where the president was going to give a speech. My grandfather had decided at the last minute, had left his camera at home. And this is a story that has been told many times. And it's interesting because this is one of those moments when I stumbled upon this in the course of my research. It was not even in the course of my research, but even before, one of those moments, and there are many of them, when I realized one of those moments that I alluded to before, where there's something that was missing in the public record. People always said, he said it was overcast, or he said he was too short and he wouldn't be able to see anything, or any number of reasons why, or he forgot the camera. But the reality was that he went to his office that morning, and his longtime secretary or assistant, Lillian Rogers, said to him, "Why don't you have your camera with you?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, I didn't bring it." And she said, "You should go home and get your camera. You love the president, you love taking movies, you should do this." And what I realized in reading all these accounts is that if you knew the family, you would know that this was not a sort of accident of fate or a near miss. This was how everything operated with him. He held back. He kind of needed to be talked into things, and he had people in his life like Lillian who would say, "You need to go home and get your camera." So in some ways there was nothing more predictable than the fact that he would leave his camera at home and she would bug him about it, and he would say he wasn't going to do it, and then she would give up and leave, and then he would go home and get it. That was how they operated. And so these are the kinds of, they're just little nuances, and maybe they don't even matter for the historical record, but they are what is true about the family and about this story. And there are many examples of that where, the way I often have said it is that, I grew up knowing very little about the Zapruder film, but I knew a lot about the Zapruder family. And when those things are fused, the public story changes. He went home, got the camera, came back, and went down with virtually everyone in his office to watch the motorcade go by. By this time, he had been taking home movies for over 30 years. So he was a quite reasonably good cameraman. And he scouted out a couple of different locations, eventually ended up standing sort of just near where that arch, you see that little archway and where it says stockade fence, kind of right around there. Set the camera to full zoom, stood up on a 4-foot-high ledge with his receptionist, Marilyn, behind him to steady him because he had vertigo, and he knew that looking through the zoom lens and following the camera was going to possibly make him dizzy, and waited for the president's motorcade to go by. And of course, we all know what followed. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, my grandfather, I'm told, was, of course, completely distraught. Everyone else on the plaza, knew that something had happened, but didn't know exactly what had happened. But he saw through the viewfinder, you all know what he saw. So he knew without a shadow of a doubt that the president was dead. And he was screaming, "They've killed him, they've killed him." He was completely beside himself. And he sort of stayed on the plaza for 10 or 15 minutes, kind of in a daze. And then he was approached by Harry McCormick, who was a Dallas Morning News reporter who had rushed over when he had heard what had happened. And Harry said to him, saw him with the camera and said, "Do you have film? Do you have some film of this?" And the moment seems to have sort of snapped him out of it. And he said, I need to speak with the federal authorities. I need to get in touch with someone from the Secret Service. Harry McCormick knew Forrest Sorrells, who was the head of the Secret Service in Dallas. And so he went off to try to find him, and my grandfather returned to his office to find another newsman there, Darwin Payne, from the Dallas Times-Herald, who interviewed him on the spot. And somewhere in this first few moments, my grandfather called my dad. And my dad recalled that he was crying and he was repeating over and over, and then that he couldn't believe that this had happened to Mrs. Kennedy in the car. But the thing that he said that stayed with me the most, that my father reported, was that he kept saying he couldn't believe that this happened in America. And I think it speaks so deeply to the terrible irony of this situation, that this was exactly the past that he had fled. This is exactly why they came to America, was to escape this kind of violence, someone being pulled off of a train and shot on the street, or political assassinations. And so for him to suddenly be thrust back into this moment, I think was deeply, deeply traumatic for him. Before, of course, there wasn't time for him to think too much about that. Forrest Sorrells came to the office with Harry McCormick, and they set about what would become an all-day process of trying to get the film developed. One very, very important thing to mention about this moment is that what Forrest Sorrells did not do was say to my grandfather, Mr. Zapruder, we're going to take your camera with the film in it, and we're going to have it processed, and we'll be back in touch with you. To which my grandfather would have, of course, said, by all means, take it. Instead, he said, let's go together and try to get this thing developed. So they didn't take it. They just sort of set out together to try to figure out how to get it developed, which was not easy. And I think it's such an important detail because it speaks so much to the time, and there's so many moments in this story when you cannot forget that it was 1963, and you cannot forget that it was before the Kennedy assassination, and everything that people did in that moment reflected this time in which, there was not only, of course, the pandemonium and chaos in the city, but also a kind of innocence and an inability to even conceive of what was to follow and what this film would eventually come to mean. They went first to WFAA in Dallas to try to get the film developed. And while they were there was a news reporter called Jay Watson who was interviewing people who had been witnesses on the street. And so he sort of nabbed my grandfather and got him on the air and interviewed him about what had happened. And this is not an interview of Abraham Zapruder of the Zapruder Film, because there was no Zapruder Film. It didn't exist yet as a thing that anyone knew. He was simply a bystander. And so I'm going to advance to the next slide, and you'll see the interview, or at least the first part of the interview, with my grandfather. And I just would ask you, while you're watching, to notice Jay Watson and what he's doing in the course of this interview, and then I have something to add about that.
A gentleman just walked in our studio that I am meeting for the first time, as well as you. This is WFAA TV in Dallas, Texas. May I have your name, please, sir?
My name is Abraham Zapruder.
Mr. Zapruder?
Zapruder, yes, sir.
Zapruder. And would you tell us your story, please, sir?
I got out and about a half hour earlier and getting a good spot to shoot some pictures. And I found a spot, one of these concrete blocks that I have down near that park near the underpass. And I got on top there was another girl from my office. She was right behind me. And as I was shooting, as the president was coming down from Houston Street making his turn, it was about halfway down there, I heard a shot. And he slumped to the side like this. Then I heard another shot or two. I couldn't say what it was, one or two. And I saw his head practically open up, all blood and everything. And I kept on shooting. That's about all. I'm just sick again.
I think that pretty well expresses the entire feelings of the whole world.
Did you notice that he's quite distracted? He's like smoking, and then he kind of is on this phone and sort of looking around. And then there's this moment where my grandfather says, then came the second shot and his head opened up. And Jay Watson turns around and locks on. And it's this moment where you realize, my grandfather knew and no one else knew. It was not public yet what had happened. And this recognition that something of tremendous import had happened.
What is he doing with that? Is that a phone?
Yeah, it's some kind of, I think he was talking, I don't know, I think maybe he was either I can't tell if it was a listening device or if it was, he was probably getting information, you know, from whoever was the engineer or producer, right, producer, right. Right, so the producer's talking.
Where he was getting
right, getting instructions, right. And you can see, of course, at the very end that my grandfather chokes up and is, you know, every time he talked about it, every time he was forced to relive it for the Warren Commission and for the Clay Shaw trial, it was always deeply, deeply painful for him to do that. It took all day to get the film developed. First at the Kodak labs to get the original film processed, during which time Forrest Orles was called back to Secret Service headquarters because Oswald had been arrested. And when he left, he said to my grandfather, if the film comes out, would you give us a copy? And my grandfather said, sure. You know, of course I'll give you a copy. So he went off, and my grandfather saw through the developing of the film, then went to another lab where 3 duplicates were made, returned to Kodak where those duplicates were processed, and then went to the Secret Service headquarters to deliver 2 of the copies of the film, one of which was sent to Washington that night and one remained in Dallas. And that is how it happened that my grandfather drove home at the end of what was a very long day with the camera, the original film, and a duplicate in the car with him. And as soon as he walked in the door, my aunt told me this story, he walked in the front door, he didn't say anything to anybody, he went into the den, pulled out the projector, set it up, and put the film in and played it for my grandmother and my uncle. And I think it's such a poignant moment. I decided to begin the book with this scene because it really speaks to the centrality of the home movie. This was, even though it was to become so many other things, it was something that was in some way related to all the other home movies he had ever taken, and yet, you know, so distorted and so heartbreakingly different. That night, my grandfather, during the course of the day, so now we're going to shift into another phase. This is the beginning of the public life of the film, which was fraught and complicated both for my grandfather and for my family and, of course, for the public. Richard Stolley was a reporter who came to Dallas, bureau chief of Life magazine, came to Dallas to report on the events and reached my grandfather at home that night to ask about seeing the film. And he had already, as I said, had several offers from several different people. And by the time he went to sleep that night, I think it is safe to say that he could see the outlines of the problem that he had. He was in possession of this film, which showed the murder of the president. The media interest was beginning to mount. The Secret Service had not taken it, so he had it, and he couldn't keep it, and he didn't want it. But what to do with it? To sell it represented the possibility of some financial windfall, which, given the life that he had lived and the poverty that he had experienced, would have been very hard to walk away from. On the other hand, to sell it felt like a terrible moral compromise, felt that it was wrong to profit in some way from this national tragedy. And so these were the sort of outlines of this dilemma that he faced. He ultimately sold it to Life magazine, and for all rights to Life magazine, it took sort of through the weekend for that to happen, for $150,000, which was a lot of money, of course, at the time. And he handled it in a way that I think I saw my own father sort of handle the later dilemmas around the film in a similar way. He chose to sell it to Life magazine, which he felt was an organization he felt he could trust. Of course, everyone trusted and loved Life magazine. He made Life magazine promise that they would treat the film with dignity and good taste, because his deepest fear was that it would be sensationalized and that it would be exploited. And he made Life magazine stipulate in the contract that they would defend the copyright to the film to prevent it from getting out and being exploited by other sources. And he ultimately gave the first installment of the money that he got from Life magazine to the widow of J.D. Tippit, who was the police officer who was killed by Oswald. And this is a small sampling of some of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters that he received for that gesture. I think my grandfather was truly tormented by this. You know, it was very difficult to walk away from what was clearly a financial benefit. But it was also, there was a high price to pay for selling it. And yet he couldn't keep it. So he sort of was trying, I think, the best way that he could to navigate those things. And again, that whole sort of story about who he was leading up to that moment, all of those things about his life played into that decision. The childhood that he had, the poverty he experienced, his love of President Kennedy, his concern for their well-being, his sense of his own values, and a deep, deep fear of an anti-Semitic backlash in Dallas. That if it came out that a Jew profited from the sale of this film, that it was going to be devastating to himself and to the Jewish community. And so this quite large donation was certainly a way to not only ease his own misgivings, but also to do something that would hopefully mitigate some of that criticism. So, some of you will remember having seen the film in Life magazine. The first images are from the first the first edition that came out the week after the assassination, and then there was a memorial edition in which the images were reproduced in color. Life magazine owned the film from 1963 to 1975. And there are two, and I was fortunate enough actually to get access to all of the Life magazine records pertaining to the film, which had been sealed until that time. And what emerges from those records is sort of the story of the first period of the film's life, when the Life magazine executives were facing this very serious problem, cultural problem, and media ethics problem, which was how to share this with the public, under what conditions. Part of the reason that Life magazine purchased the film was to keep it from the American people, because it was considered too violent, too vulgar, too distasteful, too disrespectful to the presidency and the president. And so while they could publish stills from it, they wanted to keep it from being seen as a moving picture. But this sort of storyline dovetails with the death of Oswald, which elevated the significance of the film enormously, because suddenly this became the sort of stand-in, the witness to the assassination. And the more that Life magazine withheld those images from the American people, the more pressure there was and the more interest there was for people to see it. And of course, then with the Warren Commission and everything that followed, there was this sense that, you know, you couldn't understand the Kennedy assassination without seeing the Zapruder film, and yet you could not see the Zapruder film. And so the more that happened, the more it seemed that Life magazine was colluding with the federal government, which was under suspicion as a result of the Warren Commission findings, to hide the truth. And there's so many times in this story when this is really about unintended consequences. Life magazine was functioning as editors of a magazine in a particular time and place. But the unintended consequence of what they did was to fuel the sense of suspicion and doubt and conspiracy theories that were on the rise, which themselves happened because Oswald had been killed and the film had assumed this outsized importance. These are just some of the images, some of the memos and records that I gathered. And in 1963, Life magazine did do an issue on the conspiracy theories and tried to address them. But what ended up happening over these years, and some of you may know this, bootleg copies did get out. Did any of you ever see a bootleg copy of the film in the late 60s and 70s? So bootleg copies got out. There were a number of sources, and they kind of floated around, and people got to see them. And of course, when people saw them, it furthered the sense of suspicion because viewing the film, when you view the film, it does not look like what the Warren Commission said happened. However you choose to interpret that much I think we can all agree upon. So over the 12 years that Life magazine owned and controlled the film, they never showed it as a film. It was not seen by the American people as a film for 12 years. The only time it was seen was during the Clay Shaw trial, when the film was subpoenaed, and Jim Garrison, the DA in New Orleans, showed the film to the jury and to the assembled media. And my grandfather, as you can see, was called by subpoena to testify and was put on the stand to speak about the film. One of the most important things about the film that I think is so interesting and complicated, and it has a lot of bearing, I think, on our time, the time that we're living in today, is that even when people saw the film, one of the strange, odd things about this film is that it shows what happened to the president, but it doesn't tell us what happened to the president. And there is no consensus. People look at the film and they see different things. And they look and they look and they look and they blow it up and they look at every single frame, and the answer to the question is not satisfactorily provided by this visual evidence, which in itself led to an entire sort of thread of cultural, of artists and writers and filmmakers and other people commenting in various ways about this sort of very deep idea that, there are limits to visual truth, that having the information does not lead to consensus, and that in some ways and in some cases, not only does it not lead to shared truth, but it does not bring us any closer to understanding, which I think is a very important thing to contemplate in the present day. My grandfather died in 1970 and of stomach cancer, and 5 years later, really the Life magazine was thoroughly sick of dealing with the Zapruder film. There was absolutely nothing in it to them. They were constantly under pressure by CBS and other networks to make it available so that they could air it, because of course Life magazine was a print magazine, didn't have a media outlet to show it. Criticized by Walter Cronkite, under fire for not sharing it, and Dan Rather, under fire by the public who wanted to see it. Constantly getting phone calls and emails from members of my own family wanting to know why there were bootlegs out and why it was appearing here and appearing there. And so they ultimately decided to return it to our family for $1. My dad then became, much to his regret and chagrin, but under pressure from my force of nature grandmother, who insisted that we get the film back, because I think Life would have been happy to donate it somewhere else. My father became the guardian of the film, and he immediately was faced with dealing with all of the things that Life magazine had not dealt with in all of those years. By sequestering the film and holding it and not allowing people to see it, they didn't have to sift through all the different kinds of requests and figure out who should see it and under what circumstances and for how much money and why and when and where. But that became my father's responsibility. And here I think it's important to say that, I really went through this at some length in the film, in the book, because I went through every single license agreement for the 25 years that my dad was responsible for the film. But really there was a sort of range of options. One thing was to handle it the way that Life magazine did, which was to say, no one can see it, we're not going to make it available, it's inappropriate. But that couldn't really be done anymore in 1975. What might have passed for being acceptable in 1963, post-Watergate, Vietnam War, changing times, Clay Shaw trial, all the other things that had unfolded, it was impossible. And the demand of the public and the sense that this film was becoming less and less the property of our family, and more the property of the American people, was tipping the balance. On the other hand, contrary to what many people wanted him to do, he didn't feel that he could put it in the public domain and make it available to everyone under any set of circumstances for free. Because to do so, and this was one of the few things he ever said to me about this, was if I were to do that, then there would be images of the Zapruder film on hats and t-shirts down on the National Mall. And we cannot allow that to happen. That is not what your grandfather wanted, and it's our name. The name Zapruder is attached to this. This is our legacy. And so the end result of that was that my father had to go through and make decisions one license request at a time, which was hundreds and hundreds of requests a year. He was a busy tax attorney. He had 3 children. He had a life, but this was something that he tried to do. And one of the things that I traced in the course of this work was how those decisions changed over time. He always made the film available for free to students, to researchers, to teachers, to anyone who wanted to study it. But when it came to commercial use, he tried to be judicious, and he made good decisions, and sometimes he made decisions that I think he regretted. But that was the story of the sort of gradual way in which the film made its way into American public life. In 1992, the JFK Act was passed, which made everything that was related to the Kennedy assassination available to the American people, apart from a few, several thousand documents that were held back, which we all now know about because they've just been released. And in 1978, my father had put the original film in safekeeping at the National Archives. So when the JFK Act was passed, another unintended consequence of that law was that the question arose as to whether or not the federal government had taken the Zapruder film, because it was an assassination record. It was in the holdings of the federal government. Had it been taken, and was it now to be made available to the American people and no longer our family's property? And the easiest way to describe this, and you will immediately understand what the problem was here, this is basically the principle of eminent domain, right? If the government decides that they want to build a highway through your property, they have to provide just compensation for the taking of your property. Just compensation is established by comparables. What is the comparable for the Zapruder film? How do you establish a value for this object that has no precedent and that is completely unique? And so really, that is the story of this last chapter in the life of the film, the struggle between our family and the federal government to resolve this issue, and ultimately an arbitration hearing that settled it, as you see, for $16 million. What I'd like to do to close is to read just a very short page or so from the epilogue of the book, because really at the end of the day, what I wanted to do with this story was not only to create a whole history of the Zapruder film, and the book really deals with the legal implications, the media ethics, the cultural, all of its cultural touchstones, how it was used by artists and writers and other people, and also the effect that it had on the life of our family and the way that our family shaped the film. But in the epilogue, what I wanted to address was both the public and private legacy of the film. And so I will close by reading the part of this that deals with its public legacy. What is the compelling lore that makes the assassination researchers, the film, art, and cultural historians, the writers and journalists, the academics and students and hobbyists and Kennedy buffs return to it as a touchstone time and again? I have come to think it is because the Zapruder film is in every way a conundrum. It contains its own irreconcilable contradictions. It is visual evidence that refuses to solve the mystery of who murdered the president, why, and how. It is a single strip of film in which we all see different things. It shows the entire course of history changing under the influence of a single bullet. It is quite possibly the most important historical film ever made, and yet it is an amateur home movie. It is 6 feet of 8mm film on a plastic reel that turned out to be worth $16 million. It is the most private and the most public of records. It is gruesome and terrible, but we cannot stop looking at it. But more than that, the deepest, most compelling conundrum of the film is an existential one. It lies in the arc of the film itself, the fall from grace, the unforgiving inevitability of it. It is a sunny day. A handsome husband and his beautiful wife are riding down the street, smiling and waving, with their lives stretched out before them. And within less than half a minute, his head explodes and he is dead, and she is covered in his brains and blood, trying to recover his skull from the trunk of the limousine. He is alive, and then he is dead. She is a wife, and then she is a widow. She is grace itself, and then she is sprawled across the back of the car. How can it be that our protections and illusions can be stripped from us so quickly? Most of us are able to live our days exactly because we are not confronted with this vulnerability, the inexplicable capriciousness of fate, the permanence of death. And yet there is the Zapruder film. It exists and we cannot turn away even though we fear it, and we avert our eyes and we wish desperately that it would end differently every time. Maybe it is the same impulse that causes us to watch the Challenger explode in the bright blue Florida sky, or the Twin Towers crash down into lower Manhattan on a crisp fall morning. It is because we resist the knowledge that hope sometimes turns to despair in an instant, and that tragedy comes out of nowhere on a beautiful day. And paradoxically, because sometimes we need to confront that very truth, simply to see the thing that we feel cannot happen, in order to touch for a moment the very limits of what we know about life, and to remind ourselves of the fragility of it all. Thank you.